This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics. Reviews of Daisy Blackwood, Pilot for Hire, Moby Dick, Back from the Deep, and Hana and the Firebird. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. And on the July webcomics episode, Sean and I are going to look at three really interesting titles. We're going to begin with Ryan Howell's Daisy Blackwood, Pilot for Hire. After that, we're going to check out Moby Dick, Back from the Deep by Matt Schorr and Joe Bilicic. And I maybe I'm pronouncing that name correctly. I'm not sure. And then we're going to wrap up with a completed webcomic, Katya Granger's Hana and the Firebird. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And we also have to point that out their sister company, their sister website, mydigitalcomics.com, for comics in an electronics format. We're kind of presuming that since you're listening to a podcast about webcomics, you might be more interested in the non-dead tree version. But they also have a lot of your favorite publishers available in electronic format as digital comics. You can get stuff from Action Lab and Boom Studios and Dynamite and Top Cow, Image, all sorts of great stuff there. And almost everything's available in either PDF or CBZ format, which means that it's all DRM free. Definitely a plus when it comes to electronic comics of some sort. So check out mydigitalcomics.com if you want to see any of those great comics in electronic formats.
That's right. And whether you like your comics in digital or print format, you really can't go wrong with the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com or their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. They will take care of all of your comics needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. You know, Sean, before we get into a discussion of this month's webcomics, I want to point out to our listeners that this week, the week that this episode goes up, we will be celebrating the Comics Alternative, our 6-year anniversary.
Wow.
So, yeah, we started the very 1st of August, 2012. And so we've been going strong since then. And in fact, one of the things that Paul and I discussed on the weekly review show, which should go up about a day or two after this one, is I guess as of this weekend when we're recording, we have published 737 episodes total.
Holy cow.
Of the Comics Alternative. Now, when it comes to the webcomic series, this show right now that you and I are doing is episode 41 of the webcomic series. So we've this is the 41st episode of the webcomic show. And we started, Andy Wolverton and I started the webcomic series back in December of 2014. So It's not been quite 4 years. So we've done the webcomic series for most of the time that the Comics Alternative has been around.
You know what? I want to say it does not seem like nearly that long, but like you said, since Andy was doing the co-hosting duties for at least those initial episodes, that's probably one of the reasons why it doesn't feel as long to me, certainly, because I haven't been part of the team quite as long. But I've been thrilled that we've been able to talk about all the comics that we have talked about. I've enjoyed I was really thrilled that you reached out to me in the first place to offer me kind of the chance to get in on this conversation and talk with you on webcomics. I am always about talking about webcomics. I love talking about webcomics, so it's great to be able to do that in a podcast form. And I've certainly enjoyed all of however many of those episodes were recorded by me. I've enjoyed all of them. It's always fun to find and talk about this new stuff. And I hope we can keep doing this for another 6 years at least. Yeah.
And I do appreciate you coming on board and taking over from Wolverton. And you've become, in many ways, kind of a webcomics mentor because you are much more tapped into the webcomics scene than I am. And I know that every month you introduce me to a variety of different titles. And we should mention to our listeners, not that this makes a difference, but kind of like behind the scenes information, more times than not, Sean, you are the one who recommends the webcomics that we look at. Every now and again, I'll find one and say, hey, maybe we can discuss this on the show. But I think the vast majority of the occasions, you're the one who suggests the webcomics that we look at on a monthly basis. And all three of the webcomics that we're going to be discussing today, Daisy Blackwood, Pilot for Hire, Moby Dick, Back from the Deep, and then Hana and the Firebird are all three that you recommended. So thank you very much for your expertise.
Oh, absolutely. I like I said, I enjoy talking about webcomics. I've been writing about webcomics for I don't know how long. Wish more people would be talking about them in terms of comics news coverage, and on a lot of the other the big comics news sites. And that's been one of my personal missions, is to try and get more just webcomics in general, more in the comics discussion writ large. So I'm happy to do this.
Okay, let's go ahead and start with the first webcomic that we're going to be looking at for this month, and that is Daisy Blackwood, Pilot for Hire. And this is written and drawn by Ryan Howe. You can find it at www.daisyblackwood, that's one word, daisyblackwood.com. And, this is a fun webcomic. How would you describe it to the uninitiated?
It's basically, it's kind of a throwback to the old adventure serials of the 1930s and that. Daisy Blackwood is obviously, according to the title, a pilot, and hires herself out for whatever needs to be flown from point A to point B. And in the process, she gets into a wide variety of adventures, a la Indiana Jones or something, or something like that. And as the pilot, she's not necessarily the instigator of some of these things. She's just trying to get the archaeologist to the right place or what have you. But she's very adept at making sure things go right. And, again, kind of has that serial adventure, Indiana Jones-ish kind of feel going for it.
Yes.
And the way, and it actually works out in the way that he's got the stories structure too, because it's not a single one long narrative. Even though this is kind of an ongoing comic, he's got it broken down into what you might call different issues or stories. And so Daisy will have this adventure off on an island where they're trying to get rid of a cursed stone tablet for however long it takes to do that. And then the next story might be something that's her best friend that she's just trying to have a nice afternoon with because they haven't seen each other for a while gets kidnapped and she has to go rescue her. So there's these kind of discrete individual stories, so you can sit down and read just a small portion, but they all kind of curl up into this larger narrative, and you can sit down and read the whole thing. And they're bits from later stories that harken back to the new ones, and that, again, much like the Indiana Jones series, you can watch any of those movies in and of themselves, but if you watch them all, there are little nods here and there to the previous movies.
Yes, and I think that's an important point. That right now we're on, I believe, the 6th story of Daisy Blackwood, and any one of these, I think you can, as you point out, you can read on its own without the context of the other stories. Now, a knowledge of, let's say, the earlier stories, reading the more recent ones, may help, but it's not absolutely necessary. But as you point out, you can get a broader appreciation for the entire webcomic by reading all of them. Now, the stories that we have so far, and there's, again, we're in the 6th. I think the first one was titled MacGuffin, and then The Cursed Island, and then the third one was The Stolen Socialite, then Follow That Bird, and then the penultimate one, the last one that was completed, The Dreamland Demon, and the one that we're currently on right now is Paranormal Perils. So of those, not quite 6, because Paranormal Perils we're in the middle of right now. Which one seems to really stand out for you?
I think,
or is that too difficult a question?
No. Actually, I got a lot out of the Cursed Island. I think that for a couple of reasons. I think one, I think that did a better job of introducing the characters and making sure we kind of had a establishment of who was doing what. I think with MacGuffin, it acts almost as kind of a prequel of sorts, or a prologue maybe. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't get into quite as much detail. And so I think for the Cursed Island, you really get a sense of who these characters are. You get a sense of their world. And I think I like the idea too. It's one of the things that this does that in general that you don't see as much with in Indiana Jones or something like that. I'm trying to think of the H. Riggard stuff, King Solomon's Mines and all that. Mm-hmm. What you don't get as much of in there is the actual spiritualism of it, right? Where with Daisy Blackwood, there's a lot of, okay, we've actually got ghosts going on here, and we've actually got demons that we're dealing with here. That Dreamland demon, that's not a metaphor, right? There's actually a demon involved here. Paranormal Perils, again, that suggests obviously some paranormal activity, and indeed we're talking about spirits and gnomes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, little fire creature. Right.
Yeah. And with the Cursed Island, that kind of sets all that up a little bit better than we got in MacGuffin, right? You actually, it sounds like you're kind of just starting off this Indiana Jones type of adventure, but then it gets into the spiritualism of it, and wait, there is actually something supernatural going on. Mm-hmm. The other reason that I like that is that is the only story where he attempted to do coloring.
That's right. Yeah.
He does. He doesn't do the whole story in color. He does, I think, about the half of it or thereabouts. And I really think that adds a lot. I understand why he doesn't color. Obviously, that takes a considerable amount of time, which I'm sure he does not have. But I think it adds so much. He does such a good job that it adds a lot to the story. And I'd love to see that carried through the rest.
That made me think. I was going to ask if Howe has put out print versions of his Daisy Blackwood stories, and I see on the website under support, it says support Daisy Blackwood, and Howe has both a Patreon campaign, but then also there's a link for print and PDF editions. However, when I click on that, it takes me to, looks like a file listing, and that's it. So I guess there's a problem there in terms of the hyperlink. But Do you know if Howe has made the Daisy Blackwood stories available in print?
I believe he's done the first one, the Cursed Island. If you just go to the homepage and scroll all the way down, there's another promo for it, and it actually has a photo of a stack of
I see
books.
Yeah.
So I that does not look. I mean, it's possible that was photoshopped up. That does not look photoshopped to me offhand, though. So I'm thinking he does have a pile of physical books of the Cursed Island story.
Yeah, because, I really did enjoy this webcomic. It's a lot of fun. And as you mentioned, it's kind of an old time adventure tale a la Indiana Jones, which Indiana Jones itself was kind of a harkening back to earlier cinema. But with the difference is that there's more of an overt supernatural twist. Now, granted, there was the supernatural in the Indiana Jones stories, especially that very first film. This, though, I think is the supernatural is woven more overtly throughout.
Yeah. There's certainly hints of that more than hints. There's some level of that in the Indiana Jones stuff. But it's like you said, it's a lot more ingrained in Daisy Blackwood, I think. Like with Indiana Jones, it's, you go to the first film, you go to the fourth film, here's all this stuff that's going on. Here's all these adventures. And then it's the last, 15 minutes. Oh, wait, we've got aliens or, or, oh, wait, it's the Holy Grail does actually work as a mystical weapon or a mystical tablet object or whatever. But most of the story is just around, kind of serial adventures. And here's just some guy going about his business and jumping on submarines and hitting Nazis and whatever. With Daisy Blackwood, there's a lot more of that spiritual, supernatural element. And I think that sets it apart from, like an Indiana Jones type adventure. And there have been quite a few of them. I was actually recalling not too long ago that the success of Raiders of the Lost Ark, in the immediate aftermath of that in the early 80s, there was a wealth of people trying to play off that success. There were half a dozen TV shows, following along the same tropes. And I don't know how many comic books and movies and whatever. And people were digging out all sorts of obscure characters just to write something kind of Indiana Jones-ish. Most of them failed terribly because they were cranked out very quickly to try and capitalize on the Indiana Jones success. But, there's plenty of them out there. But not too many of them, I think, were so explicit with their, that spirituality and that, mysticism. Which was one of the things I think that, like I said, sets Daisy Blackwood apart.
Right. Yeah. Now, you could even make the argument that the sequels to the original Indiana Jones was also one of those attempts that nonetheless failed, depending on your views. I mean, personally, it's the first one and then that's it. Anything after that, I think, is subpar. But then again, I'm not the biggest Steven Spielberg fan, so. Yeah,
well, you're going to get. I don't think anybody would say that Temple of Doom is their favorite. That would be? It's just a guess on my part. I've rewatched that in recent years. I used to attribute that just to that one not being as good just by virtue of a general attitude of sequelitis or something. But I sat down and watched it, a year or two ago again for first time. And I was like, you know what? Objectively, this is just not a good movie. This is just, there's a lot of problems with this. There's almost no plot. The characterization is really weak. It's just not good.
Right.
on any objective measure.
Yeah. Well, coming back to Daisy Blackwood, Pilot for Hire, you were talking about the Cursed Island being probably one of your favorites, and that leads me to mention that these stories come in different lengths. So I think the longest storylines the story arcs that we have with Daisy Blackwood so far, at least. I think the Cursed Island and the Dreamland Demon are the two longest that we've had. I don't know how long the current one, Paranormal Perils, will go for, but I think Follow That Bird is the shortest. MacGuffin, that's pretty short, but you mentioned that that's kind of like an intro to Daisy Blackwood Pilot for Hire. And in fact, if you go to the story archives and you click on MacGuffin, all the pages that are listed are described as prequel. So the MacGuffin story is maybe not a Daisy Blackwood story or narrative proper, but it's just a prequel to the rest of the stories that we'll see afterwards, like the Cursed Island, the Stolen Socialite, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think it's almost a teaser. Here's a quick taste of what I'm going to be doing here as a storyteller, and here's the types of things that I want to do. And I think it works very well. It's not bad at all by any stretch. It's just that I don't think you really get into the actual characters nearly as much as you do with Cursed Island. You get a lot more sense of not only Daisy Blackwood as a character, but kind of the way she operates, and she's not just this one person by herself. So who's her mechanic? Who's her rival? That's, just the other aviator who's trying to get business. Not necessarily not an antagonist per se, but just this other guy who's kind of running there in the background trying to do his thing, and kind of a business rival type of thing. You get a larger sense of the story world. And again, too, with the mysticism involved that shows up earlier on in the story and kind of carries through and increases as you get towards the end of the story with the actual ghost appearances and whatnot. So I think, it ends up, like I said, MacGuffin, I think, works almost as more of a prologue or a teaser, as it were. And it's a good, if you just want a real quick hit and just say, well, okay, I'm kind of on the fence on this, then maybe not your genre or what have you, or you don't like, I don't know, female protagonists or whatever. And you just want to get a quick taste of it. MacGuffin does a good job of that. But I think if you really start getting into the story proper, Cursed Island is where it starts for real. Yeah.
So again, our listeners can check this out, and we, highly recommend that you do so. I think it's a great series of stories at daisyblackwood.com. So you want to look at the second webcomic that we're discussing for July?
Sure.
Yeah, and this one is Moby Dick, Back from the Deep, and this is written by Matt Schorr with art by Joe Bilicic, and I guess I'm pronouncing that name correctly. It's Bilicic.
Your guess was probably what I'd go with. So
yeah, and well. Okay, so, let me get the URL. Yeah, people can find this at
that would help.
Back from the Deep, one word, backfromthedeep.com. And this is a webcomic that actually, this is a relatively fresh one. It began in January of this year, and it's currently ongoing, although I think we're kind of between chapters right now. I think the first chapter's been completed just maybe last week or so. But it'll be back. So, and we can talk about where this first chapter left off, and it was appropriate, if not predictable. And we are dealing with, if not the Moby Dick, then a giant whale that causes havoc that I guess is called Moby Dick. I don't think that in the story proper so far, anyone has called this whale Moby Dick, have they?
No. But we haven't seen that much of the whale itself either, I don't think.
That's right.
It's
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's early, we haven't really gotten our Ahab character yet, right? And that's who. I mean, the whale didn't name itself back in the original. It was Ahab who said it. He called him Moby Dick, and we haven't had our Ahab character show up as of yet. So no one's really had the time or inclination, I guess, to name this whale at this point.
Right. Okay. So this may sound like a nitpick, and it probably is, but I'm going to say it nonetheless. One of the things that bugged me about this, and I like this webcomic. I'll just say that outright. But one of the things that bugged me about it, when I first went to the website before I read the first page, was there's no dash between Moby and Dick. Because of the novel, of the Herman Melville novel, the title is hyphenated, Moby-Dick. But the whale itself, with only one exception, within the narrative, there are no hyphens. So it's Moby space Dick. Now, why that difference? I don't know, but that is the way that Melville wanted it. But we have no dash in Moby Dick, Back from the Deep. But I guess that's okay because we're not dealing with the Moby Dick character or figure whale. This is someone that's kind of like a Moby Dick, I guess. Although, who knows? Maybe later on we'll learn that this is the ghost or the zombie of Moby Dick, because there is something really horrific, zombie-like about this whale, the way that Bilicic illustrates him.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Well, we should probably point out too that this is, even though it's called Moby Dick, even though it's there's an obvious reference back to the Melville story, this is written more or less contemporaneously. This is a story that occurs in 2018, the year it's written. So we're not talking about a historical piece here. So that I think it sets up an expectation that, okay, this is probably not the same whale just because we're talking about 150 years plus.
Unless it's a zombie Moby Dick.
Unless it's a zombie or a ghost whale or something like that, which, we're still early in the story. We don't know where it's going yet. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we don't see what we do see of the whale is fairly limited so far. And what and the havoc he causes here seems more to me malicious than Melville's original whale.
Right.
Melville's whale to me struck me as just some creature out in the ocean doing his thing, and he attacked ships when they got too close or when they tried to spear him or whatever, but he was just basically a whale. I get the sense more with this version that the whale is being more deliberately malicious and is actively trying to harm people for the sake of harming people. And it seems more like Jaws than Moby Dick in that.
Yes. In fact, I was going to mention that this is much more akin to Jaws, again, another Steven Spielberg film that we've mentioned, than it is to Melville's Moby Dick. And in fact, the way that this story begins, the prologue and then the first chapter, is very reminiscent of Jaws. Now, in the prologue, we get this young woman, and I think her name is Susan Weatherby, we learn later, and she's on, I guess, her family's boat, and all of a sudden something hits the boat, she goes overboard, and she sinks down, and of course that's when we're first introduced visually to this Moby Dick figure. And then in the first chapter, basically you have both the mayor and the sheriff and others in the town, and they're in the town of White Sands is I think the name of their town. But they find the boat that has been beat up, and Susan Weatherby is nowhere to be found. So that's the mystery. Where is Susan Weatherby, and why is this boat really beaten? What could have done this? And so that's what gets the mystery going. Again, very much like Jaws. Mm-hmm. Another thing you have going on is kind of, I guess you could call it micro dramas or secondary dramas surrounding the mayor. And the mayor is a guy by the name of Barlow. We also get the perspective of his daughter, Catherine, who becomes important in this first chapter. And So, whereas in Jaws it was the drama surrounding the sheriff, here it's the drama surrounding the mayor, the police chief, Chief Greem, which is a weird name. But Chief Greem has something against Barlow, and in fact, he overtly states that, he hopes that in the upcoming election, Barlow is voted out of office, and that his opponent Beckman will win and throw Barlow out on his ass. He even says that to Barlow's daughter, Catherine. So Chief Greem is definitely not coming across as a likable figure so far.
Not so much.
Yeah. So we have some drama surrounding the mayor, and then toward the end of the first chapter, Barlow takes his daughter, actually his family, to the beach, and of course they're having a good time there. And again, as in Jaws, things seem to be serene on the beach until the predator shows up, not a shark, but this whale, Moby Dick. And that's where, and I enjoyed this webcomic again, but logistically, that's where I was lost in this first chapter, or that's where this first chapter lost me, because they're in relatively shallow water. How can a mammal that big just surprise swimmers undetected? It just seemed a little unrealistic. Well,
and that was kind of a complaint you could lodge against Jaws as well, right? For as big as the shark was, he should not have been able to swim in the waters that he was shown to be swimming in. Okay. It's not quite to the extreme of having a giant whale, but
or zombie whale,
as the case may be. We don't know yet, but yeah, I mean that was Jaws should not have happened just by the fact that whale, for the size that shark should have been and was shown to be, he shouldn't have been able to get that close to the shore in some of the scenes. Right. So I'll chalk that up to creative license a little bit. Maybe there's a little channel in the beach somewhere that, one part happens to be, 2 or 3 times as deep as the rest of it, or something like that. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt on that one for the sake of artistic storytelling purposes.
Right.
Here.
And it's not a deal breaker. I mean, I'm okay with that. And basically what happens is that the whale, from what I can gather, attacks this young man that Catherine seems to take a liking to, a guy named Alex. And so, he asks Catherine on a date, and then, of course, Catherine's all happy. And then he goes out for a swim, or I think maybe it's a sailboard. Sailboard. And, of course, that's when Moby Dick or Zombie Moby Dick, whatever this is, comes up and swallows him up. So, I guess Catherine's not going out on that date.
Yeah, pretty sure she's not now.
Yeah. But then, and here is the capper. And this in no way whatsoever is a spoiler, but at the very end of chapter 1, this first chapter, last page, Catherine's all distraught. And then, let me see. She hears someone behind her say, "I'm sorry for your loss, miss." And then Catherine turns around and says, "Who are you?" This guy walks up and says, "Call me Ishmael." And I don't know, it's appropriate. I almost wanted to make the sound effect, wah, 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 when I saw that. But again, I mean, you have Moby Dick, you got to have an Ishmael, and of course you have to have an Ahab. And with you, as you said, I guess we'll get an Ahab type figure later, but we do have an Ishmael.
Yeah, well, and not only do you have to have an Ishmael, if you're doing a Mobius story, you have to have the "Call Me Ishmael" line in there.
Yes, exactly.
I mean that is the classic. That's like the one opening line everybody knows. Even if you've never read Melville, people know that line. So it's almost obligatory. You have to throw that in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even though we don't have the story focalized through Ishmael, it's primarily, it seems to be focalized through Catherine, or at least Catherine's consciousness seems to be, for the most part, where we get the information, although not entirely. And that's another thing that I wondered, is the creators, are they going to move around in terms of focalization, even point of view in terms of who is narrating, because there's certain occasions in this webcomic. And again, this is relatively new. We just have this first chapter. So we don't have much to go by, but there are parts of this first chapter that Catherine narrates. And then there are other sections that are more obviously from a more omniscient narrative point of view. And I mean, and skipping around with points of view is no problem, different people telling the story. But that leads me to wonder, will at some point, maybe in the second chapter or after, will Ishmael be the one telling the story? Will he be the one who is the narrator?
I would think it would be more interesting to talk about the other people. Or to view the story from the other people.
Yeah, like Catherine or
like Catherine or the mayor or the chief of police or what have you. We've kind of already seen the story from Ishmael's point of view, right? As you go back and you read Melville, that he wrote it primarily from Ishmael's perspective.
Oh yeah, entirely from Ishmael's perspective. Yeah,
right. So, and then I think I've seen other people that wrote the story from, Ahab's perspective, or I think I saw one once where somebody wrote it from like Ahab's wife's perspective or something like that. It was like someone who wasn't even there type of thing. Right. So I'd be more interested to see, particularly with these new characters, and to see how that plays out rather than, like I said, we've seen the Ishmael perspective before. We've seen the Ahab perspective before. So I'd be interested to see some of these other people and how they view the story. Yeah.
And, earlier you were anticipating an Ahab figure at some point coming on stage, so to speak. I'm wondering if we'll get a Queequeg type figure. In other words, will there be a guy who has a lot of tattoos who becomes a part of the story?
I fully expect to see him at some point. And they'll just call him like Q or Queeg or something like that. It'll be a shortened version, I bet. But I fully expect to see him in there somewhere. You can't do an Ahab story, or you can't do a Moby Dick story without Ahab. You can't do an Ahab story without Queequeg.
That's right. Yeah. And we don't have much to go by because this just started back in January, but from what we have so far, I like this Moby Dick Back from the Deep. I don't think that it's too derivative. If anything, it has, as we mentioned, it has more in common with Jaws than it does with Melville's Moby Dick. But I think using Melville's Moby Dick as a touchstone, and then possibly, if the last page of this first chapter is any indication, tapping into and making references to the original every now and again, maybe even in kind of a jocular way, I think would be quite successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll be curious to see what direction he takes this.
Mm-hmm. And I do enjoy Bilicic's art on this. I think it works really well with the story that we have.
Yeah, I can see that being not to everybody's taste. It is definitely stylized, very much so. Not in a bad way. It's just his particular art style. But I could see that turning off some people. But yeah, I enjoy it too. I think it works well.
Yeah. And one of the things I definitely appreciate about Moby Dick Back from the Deep is that you can easily click on or tap on the current page that you're reading, and it will take you to the next one. And every now and again, we talk about, I guess, the structure of a particular webcomic, not necessarily what it's about, but how the website is set up and how easy or not so easy it may be to navigate. I think that Moby Dick Back from the Deep, you can navigate fairly well. And I didn't mention this previously when we were discussing Daisy Blackwood Pilot for Hire, but one of the things that, I like the story. I think it's great. Or the stories. But one of the things that bugged me about Daisy Blackwood is that if you clicked on the image of the current page that you're on, then basically you were taken to just that image, right? Mm-hmm. Within the browser window. And in order to go to the next page, you had to click a link that is right above the current image that you're reading. And if you don't click or tap appropriately, then you'll get an isolated image and not the next page. And so I think the navigability of Daisy Blackwood could be improved a little bit. But with Moby Dick Back from the Deep, I think that it's easy to find your way around and to go from one page to the next.
Yeah, the only concern I would have would be if you come to this down the road sometime, if we're 20 chapters into this, that might be a little problematic to try and navigate your way through it, just because the archive page for this just basically lists out all the updates one page at a time, which is fine. I mean, you can jump to any one page, but that's going to make for a really long list depending on how long this story goes.
Right. Well, maybe as the narrative progresses and they start accumulating more pages, then they will change the archive around to where it's a little more containable.
Sure.
You don't have just this long list of pages and dates.
Yeah.
Sean, you want to look at the completed webcomic that we've decided to discuss for this month?
Yeah. Hana and the Firebird, which ran from September 2015 until July of this year.
That's
so,
right. So
only recently.
Wrapped up.
Yep.
And this is by Katya Granger, and you can find it at Hana Firebird. That's one word, HANAFIREBIRD.tumblr.com. So this is a Tumblr webcomic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting in that you can tell that this is an older, at least it started, quite a while ago, again, back in September of 2015. I don't know of many people who use Tumblr now for webcomics, but I think that was more common several years ago.
Yeah, and I get the impression, I seem to recall reading somewhere in here that this was her first attempt at a webcomic, and it was mainly set up almost as a kind of an experiment, and see how, just to kind of get the feel of how it works and how updating it on a regular basis works and whatever. And for something that you're only doing that as an experiment, Tumblr's a great platform for that. You don't have to invest in web domains or your own hosting company or anything like that. You can just upload the images and keep to your schedule and, just worry about the actual craft of doing the comic itself.
Yeah. And in fact, if you go to the very first page or the home page, you have Granger mentioning that some of the things that you just stated, that this is her first webcomic and she was learning the game, so to speak. There are things about this that she's not entirely happy with. And because of that, it'll probably never see print, but she wanted to use it as a way of learning, webcomic design. And so, she even mentions the fact that she does keep it on Tumblr. So the author is aware of, I guess, the shortcomings or the limitations of this webcomic. And I appreciated that. And I read this kind of context, this setup that she writes on the very first page before I started the webcomic proper. And I think it helped me to appreciate better what was going on, because as I was reading through Hana and the Firebird, there were parts of it that were a little confusing to me. I think in terms of narrative, there's some gaps that could have been filled in. But again, knowing that this was her first webcomic and she was experimenting and she was just trying new things and she was aware of the shortcomings, I think I was much more apt to give her a pass in terms of some of those problematic issues.
Yeah. Now, see, I actually did the opposite. Is I did not read that until after I had read the entire comic. And for me, it was, as I was reading the comic, I was noticing some of those same issues and some of the problems. And I was like, I'm not a fan here. And this doesn't really work or what have you. And And it was only after reading through all of it and then kind of scanning through her text and saying, oh, okay, that makes sense. She understands what this is. That was kind of my problem, is coming to this, I had a different set of expectations than what I should have, essentially. And I think that unfortunately colored my reading of the comic a little bit. Okay. Because I was expecting something that this is not, in terms of craft, in terms of promotion, in terms of, everything that kind of goes into building a webcomic.
Yeah. I mean, you can tell that this is an initial effort by a creator. And even with its shortcomings, though, I think that it is worth checking out. Now, what is Hana and the Firebird about? Actually, if you go to the About page, I think it nicely kind of encapsulates the story. It says, Hana was never fond of Aiden, even before they learned he might be the reason why the world is going to end. As the three children search for the truth behind the end of the world, all the sorrow, paranoia, anger, and frustration that has been bubbling up in Hana comes to a boiling point. Now, I think that kind of glosses some of the stuff or a lot of the stuff that goes on. So, for instance, from that description, we really don't know exactly why Hana is sorrowful, paranoid, angry, frustrated. But we do learn in the webcomic, kind of indirectly, that it has something to do with the death of her sister, which she feels responsible for, even though she shouldn't. Right. The people of the village tell her that she shouldn't feel responsible for that. Also in this description, we really don't get much about this character, Aiden. And in fact, in a way, you could argue, I would think, that from my reading, that we don't get much in the webcomic proper about Aiden. Now, Aiden, okay, this is this fantastical land where everyone has some kind of power of some sort. So for Hana, her power resides in grass. In other words, she can make grass do things through, I don't know, whatever powerful means that she has. Their companion, Hannah's companion, Sparks, his power is lightning. Although I don't really see Sparks, again, appropriately named, utilizing his powers much, if any, in the webcomic. Maybe I'm just forgetting those occasions. And then the third in this trio, Aiden, his power is fire. And we do see examples of his use of fire and maybe his uncontrolled use of fire, not knowing how to manipulate it, which does cause some problems. Now, we learn that Aiden has come to this community, but he can't remember how he got there or why he's there. And so there's this big, what is it? Does he have amnesia? I don't know. Is he just a blank slate? We don't know. But Hana seems to think, and some of the townspeople seem to think, that Aiden is this legendary figure who comes to them, who basically portends the end of the world. And so that, again, becomes part of the anger and the frustration and the paranoia that I think that Hana feels, because she's already that way. But then, even though she's friends with Aiden, she doesn't entirely trust him. And so she suspects that he may be this legendary figure. And I can't remember what it's called. It starts with a K. Kyoku? Something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Part of this folklorish legend, someone who is going to bring the end of the world with them as he comes into the community. And so, but Aiden is this kid who seems harmless. He is easily manipulated. He is rather passive. I don't know. The thing about Hana and the Firebird is I wanted more about Aiden. I wanted more in this relationship, especially between Hana and Aiden. I don't feel that we got enough. What is your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that goes to, and that speaks to some of the limitations she's had as a creator, and which she recognized in creating the story, because she set this up as Hana's story. This is Hana's journey emotionally. I mean, the title itself, Hana and the Firebird, right?
Right.
So Aiden is a secondary character. But I think that's where one of the challenges that she's looking to kind of work through as a creator is making sure she provides enough characterization and enough interaction with the secondary characters that is sufficient for their role in the book. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, we do have this kind of second rescue team of what is it, Gao and Sumo and or what is it, Tsutomo and
Daichiro.
Yeah, and Daichiro. And we get very little characterization on them, but that's okay because they're far enough into the background.
Right. And by the way, you said this second rescue team that Hana, Aiden, and Sparks are also a rescue team. And, that's not really explained. I mean, what is a rescue team? I guess it's a group of individuals who go out and do things, take on certain tasks, rescue. But we know that Hana, Aiden, and Sparks are a rescue team. And we do see them, I guess, in action. But I don't know if rescue teams are ever explained.
It's hinted at. I think at least what I got out of it is, they act as kind of a catch-all fireman, policeman, hey, just save people kind of thing. Whatever the problem is, they'll go in and sort things out. Because, again, all of the people in this world have powers of some sort. Mm-hmm. So they can use their powers of, fire or lightning or what have you to help people out of a jam and against whatever the monster is or whatever. But then there's a capitalism aspect of this as well, where they're expected to be paid in some fashion for these services. Mm-hmm. And that actually ends up being a launching point for Hana, is Aiden and Sparks are able to save one of her friends, one of Hana's friends, but that friend isn't able to pay them. So Hana joins their rescue group as a means of payment, right. And says, hey, and so that's what I got out. It's kind of like your catch-all, SWAT team, police, rescue, fire, ambulance, all of that kind of roll into one. Whatever you need will be your heroes. Almost kind of like a heroes for hire kind of situation.
Right.
And, it's just based in a capitalistic environment so that, when they save you, you have to pay them.
Right. Now, that scene that you just described, that a friend of Hana's had Aiden and Sparks do a task, but he couldn't pay. So Hana, in essence, pays up by joining the team. This occurs in the second half of this webcomic, and it's a flashback. But it threw me for a while because I didn't know that it was a flashback at the time. Mm-hmm. There was no indication in the narrative that Hana at this point was thinking back to maybe how she originally came to join this team. But I kind of figured it out after I got several pages into the flashback. But I found that a little frustrating. And, at the very least, give some kind of, narrative tag that we're about to have a flashback of some sort.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the creative challenges that she gave herself from a storytelling perspective, mm-hmm. that she didn't quite have the talent for yet. Because there's a lot of really, I think, challenging ideas or processes involved in the story she's trying to sell and how she's trying to tell that story. And they're not quite there yet in terms of her talent to be able to pull off everything super effectively. So you end up with like kind of these weird shifts as a reader, where you're going, wait a minute, where are we? What's going on? And then you only later find out, okay, yeah, this is supposed to be a flashback, or we're now talking to these other characters, or we flashed forward again, or what have you. Mm-hmm. And those transitions, she doesn't have the at least when she was creating the story, she didn't have quite the talent to be able to pull that off effectively. it's some really challenging stuff in there. I sat there reading, is like, okay, I've seen people do this before, and it's not an easy way to pull off, and when I do see it pulled off successfully, I sit back and go, wow, that was really cool, the way they did that. Mm-hmm. But it's really difficult to pull off well, I think. And I think she maybe set up some challenges for herself that were just a little bit beyond her reach at this point.
And again, it brings us back to what we were mentioning earlier. On the very front page, Granger indicates that, she knows of the limitations of this webcomic. Mm-hmm. And, for that reason, she probably won't put out a print edition of it. Nonetheless, it was a learning experience for her. And that comes back to, I guess, a larger issue that every now and again we bring up. And that is one of the differences between webcomics and print material is that with a webcomic, an artist can explore and experiment and grow in ways that they can't when they're working on a more traditional print publication. And in fact, reading a webcomic, you can see the evolution of the creator, both in terms of their storytelling abilities and their art over time. And there are many examples over the years that you and I have discussed where we can see the development or the growth of an artist from the very beginning of a webcomic toward the very end, where they do hone their craft. And so that's what Granger was doing with Hana and the Firebird.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent example of what you really need to do if you want to be a webcomic creator. There's a lot of people out there, I think, who say to themselves, yeah, it would be cool. I've got this great story idea, but I don't think my talent is quite there yet, or I don't have things quite fleshed out enough, or whatever. I think really honestly, that she's taken the best approach that you can here, and is just to go out and do it.
Yeah.
And just get it done and put it out there and figure out in a real world practical sense where your limitations are, what you need to work on, what you think works well for you, what doesn't work well, figure all that out. Don't just sit down and conceptualize that. I mean, yeah, you have to figure out what your story is and all that, but just kind of noodling on that in the back of your head doesn't get anything done. You just really need to sit down and do it. And I give her a lot of credit for doing that, and then and then at the end of it too, recognizing here, yeah, okay, this maybe wasn't the best thing I ever did. And, I could have fixed this better, or this maybe didn't work as well as I thought it would. And kind of going out there, doing it, and then analyzing what you've done when you're done with it and seeing where you can improve, where your strengths seem to lie, which may or may not coincide with what you thought your strengths were. Mm-hmm. So I give her a lot of credit for going through and doing that.
Yes.
That's not an easy task, especially for, this ran for 3 years. So, that's a significant undertaking.
Yeah. And it's funny that, you mentioned that it ran for 3 years. I found that this was a relatively short, I guess, given the fact that it was created over a 3-year period, and containable webcomic. It was, as she indicates on the front page, updated only once a week. But even then, there are occasions where she took a hiatus. So it's not one of those backbreaking webcomics that will take you forever, to read. One question, though, I have about this webcomic is the Firebird. Okay, we got Hana, I know, and she has a prominent place in this narrative. We do see the Firebird, but we don't see the Firebird until toward the end. And so I'm wondering, why title this webcomic Hana and the Firebird? Because the Firebird doesn't really seem that important.
I think it was more of it's a recognition of the emotional point that represents in Hana's journey. Yeah. Because even though the character of the Firebird isn't that significant and doesn't have that much time in and of itself, it represents the pivot point for Hana as a character, and where she says, okay, this is why I was, mopey and depressed and guilty and felt guilty all the time. And this is how I'm going to be different because of this interaction I've had with the Firebird.
Right.
So I think it boils down to an emotional pivot point for her, and that's why it's Hana and the Firebird and not, the rescue team in the Firebird or Aiden
Hana
in the
and
Firebird.
Aiden,
yeah, it's anything like that. It's very much
Hana
Hana's
and the
story.
mysterious power.
Right. Yeah. It's Hana against the end of the world. There's all sorts of story titles they could have gone with. But I think the Firebird is kind of using the Firebird as a title is kind of the recognition that's her turning point. That's her pivot point. For within the context of this story.
And again, our listeners can find this at hanafirebird.tumblr.com. Sean, 3 webcomics that we looked at for July. We started off with 2 current ongoing webcomics, the first of which was Daisy Blackwood, Pilot for Hire by Ryan Howe, and our listeners can find that at daisyblackwood.com. After that, we looked at Moby Dick, Back from the Deep, written by Matt Schorr with art by Joe Bilicic, and that is at backfromthedeep.com. And then we wrapped up with a very recently completed webcomic, Hana and the Firebird by Katya, Granger, and our listeners can find that at hanafirebird.tumblr.com.
Definitely some interesting stuff there worth checking out for a variety of different reasons.
That's right. And check those out. And if you want great comics like the ones that we discuss in our webcomic show, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now, and there you're going to find a lot of print comics at incredible discounts. If you prefer your comics in digital form, then go to their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. So dcbservice.com, mydigitalcomics.com. You can't go wrong with either of those. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's webcomic episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or if you want to get in touch with us via email, we've certainly got that as an option as well. Might be a little easier if you have some URLs of some webcomics you'd like us to check out. You can email us at twoguys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can email me directly at Sean, SEAN, at comicsalternative.com.
Or me, Derek, at comicsalternative.com. And you'll find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's the easiest one for me to remember at any rate.
Yeah, just go to comicsalternative.com, click on Contact Us, and there you'll find a variety of ways to get in touch. And we do like to hear from you, so definitely contact us. And as Sean pointed out, feel free to suggest webcomics that we can look at for future episodes.
Absolutely. Always interested in finding out new stuff and seeing what else people are putting out there.
That's right. Until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you next month.